Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Susie Nikiema from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and I'm really glad to welcome you to this webinar on reflecting on a year online lesson from an IISD survey on international investment negotiators. Thank you for joining us today. We will start our discussion soon with the introductory remarks from Natalie Bernasconi Osterwalder, who is the Executive Director of IISD Europe and head of IISD's Economic Law and Policy Program. She will give a brief introduction to the topic and explain the motivation for organizing this webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Susie, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this IISD webinar. Today, we will discuss how, in the past year, everything changed around international negotiations, including, of course, international investment negotiations. Since March last year, delegates are no longer traveling to New York, to Vienna or Geneva to meet face-to-face to negotiate the reform of investor-state dispute settlement or to negotiate investment facilitation. No, they are sitting in their offices in capital or in their country mission or in home offices or in kitchens or children's rooms to intervene on Interprify or other platforms to put forward positions and listen to interventions of other delegations. But how do you negotiate online? How do you read a room? How do negotiators gather information, build coalitions, and reach compromises online? What are the new barriers to participation? And in particular, how are the less formalized elements of negotiations, which proved to be so vital in the past, how are they replicated in an online setting? These are questions that we wanted to investigate and understand in order to help develop tools and guidance for developing country negotiators in the future. As a first step, we conducted a survey which we will present to you today as a basis for our discussion, along with some preliminary recommendations. As we were conducting the survey, we learned that the Commonwealth Secretariat was also undertaking research on virtual negotiations in the area of trade negotiations. And we had excellent exchanges on our findings. We are very fortunate to hear more about the Commonwealth Secretariat study today as well. This excellent study is very complementary to the survey conducted by IISD, and we are thrilled to have this opportunity to collaborate and exchange with the Commonwealth Secretariat on such an important topic. But now I would like to turn back to Dr. Susie Nikiema, whom you've already met. Susie is a senior international law advisor and leads IISD's investment program. She will be moderating today's panel and will introduce our expert panel and the structure of the webinar today. Susie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for this introduction that provides an excellent background for the discussion today. I'm very happy to now introduce our 5 estimated speakers and discussants who will be elaborating on the key issues and challenges arising out of the new virtual statu quo. Each of them has an in-depth understanding of online negotiations, albeit from different perspectives of academia, negotiating observers, and negotiators, which will greatly enrich our discussion today. At the outset, please let me introduce Taylor St. John and Zoe William, who have conducted this survey on virtual negotiations and co-authored the upcoming IISD-related publication. Taylor is currently a lecturer at the School of International Relations of the University of St. Andrews and a knowledgeable observer unpacking some of the key multilateral investment negotiations. Zoe is an associate with IISD Economic Law and Policy Program, as well as the managing editor of Investment Treaty News, a publication that I hope several of you have subscribed to. As such, she has considerable experience in analyzing and reporting trends and reform of the international investment regime. Today, we are also glad to welcome our three discussants that will share their experience, reflect on the survey's findings, and make preliminary recommendations from various perspectives. We have Mrs. Sise Aminata Traore. She is Permanent Secretary of the Superior Council of the Private Sector of the Republic of Mali. And we have Queen Vu. She is Deputy Director General of the Department of Legislation of the Ministry of Planning and Investment of Vietnam. Aminata and Queen have both extensive experience in multilateral investment negotiations before and during the new virtual reality, particularly at the UNCITRAL Working Group 3 on Investor-State Dispute Settlement Reform. We can't wait to have your valuable insights from a practitioner perspective. Last but not least, we have Jeff Tidman. He is a global policy and strategy consultant, as well as an associate researcher at Lausanne University's Global Sport and Olympic Studies Center. As an expert in trade diplomacy and academia, Jeff will provide a comparative perspective from his recent study from the Commonwealth Secretariat that Natalie just referred to. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today to discuss the important topic. We particularly appreciate the participation of those who are joining from different time zones at a particular late or earlier hour. After all, this is a perfect illustration of one of the constraints of virtual meetings. Let me now end here with a brief description of how we will run this discussion. So today's discussion in terms of agenda. Next, please, thank you. Will be divided in two parts. Each part will be opened by a presentation of the survey conclusions, followed by a discussion with our three discussants, and then a Q&A session with all the participants on the chat. The first part will focus on the key findings of the survey. And in the second part, we will try to identify possible recommendations and solutions. Without further ado, I would like to turn over to Taylor to set the scene by presenting the objective, methodology, and key findings of the survey. Taylor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susie. And I hope you all can hear me in another perfect illustration of what it's like this year for the negotiators and for all of us. My neighbor has decided to do something very noisy right now, so hopefully this will block out that noise. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. And it feels oddly appropriate, of course, that we're together virtually. And I want to start out by thanking you, since many of you on the call today completed the survey. We received wonderful responses from around the world. So first, a truly heartfelt thank you for taking the time to do that. I'll be discussing, as Susie mentioned, the survey questions and the findings, and then Zoe will speak later about the recommendations coming out of the survey. So first, our aims. The idea for the survey came from Natalie and from Susie, and it was since one of the things that seems to be more difficult online is to really hear from others and to share reflections. A survey was a good way of collecting responses about what the year had been like and starting a conversation about what we know 1 year in. And I want to emphasize that start a conversation is a key word. Our conclusions today are preliminary. We're all still learning. So this is meant to really kick off a discussion about what negotiators have experienced during the past year, what might change going forward, what we know now. And we think that particularly given the financial and the environmental costs of in-person meetings, completely virtual or hybrid negotiations might continue, right, even after the pandemic recedes. So this makes it particularly important to ask questions like, what challenges do virtual negotiations present, especially for developing countries? How is the conduct of negotiations different online, or is it different? We think it is, so we're interested in how it's different. And what is gained and what is lost when negotiations are conducted virtually? So that's what we were hoping to get at. In order to get at those questions, we wrote a survey that was tailored. One survey was tailored toward UNCITRAL Working Group 3. One survey was tailored toward the joint statement on investment facilitation, which is being undertaken by a group of WTO members. And the survey was available, or both surveys were available in English, French, and Spanish. And we disseminated the surveys using a Qualtrics, which is an online survey tool. So we sent the survey to 187 UNCITRAL and 53 JSI negotiators. And our response rates were 26 and 34%, which is pretty good for this kind of online survey. And as you can see in this figure, our respondents came from several regions, with Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America being particularly well represented. Our respondents also came from a variety of different ministries, and they serve in a variety of roles. So some focus primarily on investment treaty negotiation, some focus on investment dispute defense, some serve in the permanent missions to the WTO. So they come from a variety of roles, but this reflects kind of where negotiators sit within governments, right? They sit in a variety of places. So what we first asked our respondents about is what barriers, if any, they faced to participating in negotiations. And we found that for in-person negotiations, really important barriers were the cost of travel and hotel, getting ministry approval, learning about meetings with adequate notice, and obtaining a visa. Those were the top 4 obstacles to in-person. Those barriers largely disappear with the switch to virtual negotiations, but new barriers appear. So the most commonly raised barriers in virtual negotiations were time zones and competing priorities at work, which was really a strong finding of the survey, so we'll come back to that later. Other challenges were unreliable internet or inadequate computer software or computer equipment more generally. And that wasn't raised, those kind of IT or technical challenges were not raised by many of our respondents, but for those respondents who did raise them, they were very, very, very important challenges that really profoundly affected participation. We also asked our respondents how they prepared for in-person and virtual negotiations. And our respondents reported preparing in broadly similar ways for both in-person and virtual negotiations. And so you see in the table on the slide, the ways that they prepare. By discussing with other officials in their ministries, by discussing with other ministries, by reading submissions or preparatory papers, by attending capacity building seminars or other webinars, and so on. However, one difference that we did find when it came to preparing is that some respondents reported dedicating less time when they were preparing for virtual negotiations. So this was also echoed when we asked them for text responses. Many of our respondents noted feeling that the stakes of virtual negotiations were just less palpable, that they weren't having side conversations or they weren't having human interactions, so the experience felt flatter. And just one final note on preparation, which isn't specific to virtual negotiations, but more of a reflection of existing asymmetries. When we asked our respondents to estimate how many hours they prepare for each negotiation, the range was between some governments saying 3 hours is what we prepare, and other governments saying over 100 hours is what we prepare for each session. So that was very striking. When we then asked if our respondents were more likely to attend negotiations because they were virtual, we asked questions about how their attendance might be different. we generally found that the lower costs of virtual negotiations led to more states and also more officials from each state attending the negotiation. So 39% of respondents said their delegation was more likely to attend a virtual negotiation, while 43% of our respondents said they were as likely to attend. And again, the big reason for this is lower costs. 50% of respondents said that their state was more likely to have officials from multiple ministries if the negotiations were virtual. 37% said their state would send a larger delegation, and 26% said that more junior delegates would attend when negotiations were virtual, right? So the picture emerging here is that more states and more officials from each state are able to attend. However, the possible downside here is that some of our respondents reiterated concerns about the quality of negotiations. So they had raised this earlier in their survey, and then when we asked about attendance, they said, well, it's complicated because we may be sending more people, but yet people may not be paying quite as much attention when the negotiations are online. So what we also found is when we asked officials how they were communicating with other delegations, that in-person negotiations, a lot of important communication is informal, right? A lot of it is taking place over coffee or in the hallway, or also via text message or email between negotiators. And strikingly, at in-person UNCITRAL negotiations, our respondents said that text messaging or WhatsApp was almost as common as talking to each other in person. And our respondents said they were using WhatsApp not just to schedule in-person chats or meeting each other later for lunch or something like that. They were actually using text messaging to discuss what's happening or to share their reactions or to coordinate the statements that they were making on the floor. So since negotiators are already using these online tools, it isn't surprising that they continue to contact each other via email and text message and WhatsApp, as well as the platform Interprify's chat function during virtual negotiations. But interestingly, what we found is that negotiators do not seem to be contacting each other as often during virtual negotiations. So 70% of our respondents reported being in contact with the other negotiators less frequently during virtual negotiations. And actually, a sharp drop in informal contact is one of the strongest findings to come out of our survey. So 70% of our survey respondents said that speaking informally with other officials was a high priority at in-person negotiations. But then many of our respondents emphasized that they were not having these same informal chats in virtual negotiations, and that the absence of informal conversations or spaces to get to know one another or to just share information informally was really one of the most profound changes in the move from in-person to online negotiations. So given that negotiators think these informal interactions are really important, and given that they aren't happening from our data, a key challenge going forward is to think about how these informal chats can be replicated in a virtual environment. We also asked negotiators about arranging cooperation, how they decide to cooperate with one another. And we found that negotiators often identify allies and arrange to cooperate with them through informal chats, perhaps again, coffee breaks or lunches or having dinner together. And when we asked our respondents to think back to the last time they had agreed to cooperate with another country, and we asked them, would this cooperation have happened in virtual negotiations? Most respondents said no, this cooperation would not have happened. And they tended to give one of three reasons why not. So the first reason is because it would be difficult to identify who to cooperate with and figure out how to contact them. As one respondent wrote, "You do not know the relevant person, or it's just difficult to see them." A second reason is because interaction is more limited in virtual negotiations, human contact is missing, and this makes it difficult to cooperate. So one respondent wrote, "There's no way of identifying, talking, or exchanging ideas in a virtual negotiation." So another wrote, "Human contact is very important in negotiation because it enables people to reconcile different points of view." And a third reason why this cooperation was more difficult is because reaching consensus or reaching some sort of an agreement requires what one negotiator or one respondent called a safe space in which officials can feel comfortable discussing or trying out ideas before they're made into official positions without putting them down on paper as formal precedents. Another major finding of the survey is a challenge that almost all of our respondents emphasized, is that they have not been able to focus just on virtual negotiations. So they reported feeling unable to focus because they were also expected to complete day-to-day work. And this was raised by over half of our respondents, that if they had traveled to a negotiation, they would be seen as out of the office. But since they hadn't traveled, they were seen as still being in their office, and therefore they were expected to attend other meetings or complete day-to-day work. And so, as one respondent noted, right, the attention of each participant in virtual negotiations is divided between the meeting and the day-to-day work. And there are lots of other insightful quotes in our paper. So once it is online, I encourage you to look at some of these responses because they were exceptionally detailed and useful. But we want to have lots of time for discussion, so I'll skip right to the benefits and drawbacks now. The main benefits, as one respondent put it very succinctly, is less expense, more delegates. So the costs of virtual negotiations are lower for states. The ease of attending means wider access. More states can attend, more individuals from each state or more ministries from each state tend to be then listening to the negotiations. And so for the JSI in particular, this means more participants from capital. Whereas at UNCITRAL, it tended to mean more ministries, larger delegations, sometimes 12 or 15 individuals attending from each state. The drawbacks of virtual negotiations are less informal interaction, which leads to less deliberation, less information sharing, or less exchange of ideas. So as one respondent noted, social interaction with other delegates is important. It's not the same to interact through online platforms. It really lacks the personal touch. Another noted that online, there's not enough space to convince others or to be convinced, and that personal contact is also an opportunity for exchange and for learning, and those sorts of things aren't happening in virtual negotiations. Finally, many of our respondents felt that they were extracting less information from the virtual negotiation. So as one put it, virtual negotiations are more solitary, they're lonelier. One does not have even a hint of the reactions of others, or even the possibility of reading others' body language or reaction to ideas. So in a virtual environment, one does not always know what's happening in the room, and that's always important information. So negotiators are less able to read the room when it's a virtual environment. And not being able to see the reactions of others might have several kind of knock-on consequences. So one thing it might do is it also might inhibit quieter states from speaking. If typically smaller states work in coalitions or work together to amplify their influence, it might be more difficult to do this virtually if it's harder to work out the coalition and to agree to cooperate. In addition, some states, of course, are more affected by software or internet issues, or more affected by time zone issues. They're further from Vienna or Geneva. So for several negotiations, we think that For several reasons, sorry, we think that virtual negotiations may sideline some participants and mean that the negotiations might be dominated by a smaller set of voices. But we want to get to discussion, so Zoe and I will leave it there for now so that we can hear from all of you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Taylor, for this excellent presentation, clear and great summary of the comprehensive report's findings. And I hope, and I'm pretty sure this makes our participants eager to read the final report when we release it soon. And just to remind everyone that this will be available very soon, and we will make sure to make it available to you after this webinar. I would like to already invite the participants on the chat to start posting some clarification question or some comment as you wish. And for now, I would like to turn to our discussant and start with Geoff. So Geoff, thank you for joining us again today. We heard that you have conducted a study entitled Influencing Outcomes in a Changing Environment at the WTO, a Commonwealth Developing Country Perspective. Could you briefly describe the objective and methodology of the study, and particularly to what extent such objective and methodology were maybe similar or different to the study conducted by Taylor and Zoe for IISD?
Sure. Hello, everyone from Washington. And on the subject of background noise, if you hear an odd hum in the background while speaking, it is because the 17-year cicadas are out in force here in Washington. They're flying and dying on the sidewalks, and they're buzzing, and you can hear them at all hours of the day and night at this time. This only happens once every 17 years, so it's something to note that the natural world marches on, irrespective of our efforts or lack of efforts to take care of it. So, just interesting. And let me start by thanking Natalie for inviting me to join in with your seminar and share our findings from the Commonwealth Secretariat research project. It's a great privilege to be here with you. Our objective for our study was to assess the shift to online and hybrid meeting negotiations at the World Trade Organization, particularly the impact that this has had on small states, LDCs, and sub-Saharan African states in the Commonwealth. Now, as you know, this group of states already faces particular obstacles in negotiating, obstacles of capacity, of negotiating leverage, etc. So we wanted to look at what are the particular challenges and opportunities that they face as a result of this shift to online. We were delighted when we discovered how closely our findings overlapped with that of the IISD study. We had not seen their study before we completed our first draft, and they had not seen ours before they completed theirs. So I think it was a mutually, pleasurable finding that these two projects have dovetailed so well. So the second part of our project, as with the IISD study, was to survey the post-pandemic future of meetings and negotiations at the WTO. What is likely to persist from this period, what might not, and how our interviewees have felt about that, and drawing from that to make recommendations for policy to figure out ways to retain the gains that have been achieved from online and hybrid negotiating and meeting, and to limit the disamenities from that. So our methodology for our study was to start by doing a survey of the published literature already, which is of course very, very new and kind of happening in real time, even while we were working on this, ranging from looking at WTO documentation speeches and comments made by senior officials and so forth, as well as work that's been done on the impact of the different online meeting technologies and functionalities. We then conducted a series of open-ended interviews with approximately 20 officials in Commonwealth states. And this was a body that included representatives of developed countries, of LDCs, small states, and sub-Saharan African states in the Commonwealth. We also spoke to representatives of regional organizations, such as the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which participate in the negotiations on behalf of their member states, which frequently are small states with less negotiating capacity of their own. We talked to senior staff at the Commonwealth Secretariat who are tasked with helping our target group of countries engage in their negotiations in Geneva. So we asked what their experiences have been, what has gone well, what has gone less well or badly. We asked them what they would change if they could. And we asked what they expect the meeting and negotiating landscape to look like in the post. We anonymized their responses so they would feel free to speak freely, and so that we could quote them, much in the way that was done in the IISD study. And also, I again comment that as with IISD's project, our results are not statistically significant, but they are illustrative. So what did we find that was then into the IISD study? And I think the big points Taylor made very well, that the biggest challenge to negotiating is that it is much harder to hold our conversations informally, both during and prior to the negotiations. And it is much more difficult for negotiators to get to know their counterparts personally. This has been a real challenge, and the go ahead.
Me? It
Yes.
seems that some participants had trouble to listen to you. Maybe if it's help, do you think you can maybe shift off your camera so we can see if it's better in terms of understanding what you are saying? Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, we'll try that. So let me know if that's better. We can switch that off for a while and see how that goes. Okay. That's all right. So again, the reasons for the barriers to virtual participation were again similar to the barriers found in IISD's study. Logistics were significant. The time zones problem, the problem of competing work demands, the challenges by if you're negotiating from capital, you are expected to carry on your daily brief even while negotiations are going on. Technology problems, as we may be experiencing here, significant problems of connectivity. One issue we particularly found was a concern in several countries, developing countries, LDCs in particular, was the cost of data. Whilst they clearly, the delegates save money by not having to travel to Geneva, the cost of data is still a significant barrier to participation for a number of LDCs, delegates in a number of LDCs. We found in terms of attendance, similarly, much more participation by capital-based officials. Overall, we found a larger attendance online, as IISD found. And again, we had the comment that making new connections for delegates with other counterparts was, for the first time virtually, is very difficult. Now, significant differences did we find from the IISD study? Just mention a few of those. I think we asked some more specific questions about which meeting technologies delegates use, which ones worked better and worse, what technology barriers they faced, and what was coming and what was expected in that regard. We focus particularly on the digital divide problem, issues about bandwidth and cost faced by developing countries, sub-Saharan African countries. We look at privacy and security in some detail as well. Another key point of difference in our study is, I think, in the way that we use the term hybrid. In the IISD study, hybrid has tended to be used for some in-person and some online negotiations, whereas the way we used hybrid was simultaneously a combined negotiating format where some delegates are in the room and others appear virtually at the same meeting. So it's just it's a semantic distinction. But when I talk more about the recommendations in the next section, I'll come back to that, the role of hybrid in the way that we use it.
Thank you very much, Jean, for this great presentation. It's really interesting to see that while we are conducting the two studies very independently, we came up finally with some similar findings, but it's also good to see the complementarity in terms of the finding, and we will see also later on in terms of possible recommendation and solutions. So thank you very much for your comparative, sharing this information with us, and also to let the participant know that this study also is at the final stage, and hopefully it will be published soon, and we'll make sure to make it available for those who are interested to have a look on it. So now I would like to go to turn to Queen and Aminata, and I will start with Queen. Taylor has presented in terms of finding some barriers and challenging, also some opportunities. But if you want to start with the barriers and the challenges from your experience as a negotiator, which of the challenge that she presented is the most important for you or your delegation? Maybe if you have a concrete example based on your personal experience you want to share with us in terms of illustrating some of these kind of challenges that Taylor just presented. Queen?
Thank you, Susie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to IISD, Natalie and Susie for giving me the chance to participate in this webinar. Following Susie's suggestion, I'd like to share some of my observations during negotiation of investment treaties, including the discussion in Ancitran about ISDS reform and other investment negotiation, both bilateral and multilateral. With regards to the most important barrier to negotiation while using virtual negotiation or online negotiation, I think the most important one is the lack of interpersonal contact. That means when we have new negotiation and new negotiator, it's very difficult for us to get to know the other colleague personally. I mean, not just officially, but we want to know about the negotiating style, the type of person they are, and we cannot we cannot see the face of the person very clearly, because in the multilateral negotiation, everybody have a very small part of the screen, and the screen only show the face, so we cannot watch the body language, and we cannot assess the real intention and emotion, and I mean, there is a huge layer, like the big part of the iceberg with regard to the person that we cannot get information. The other part that had not been address very in details is the limited time in virtual negotiation. Because of the time difference, online negotiation cannot prolong too much like we normally have in person negotiation. For example, regards to investment chapter in FTA, we used to have like 5 consecutive negotiation day, and each day can last from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. normally, and sometimes it can be extended until 9 or 10 p.m. or midnight, something like that. But this cannot be happen in virtual negotiation. Therefore, we have to squeeze everything in 2 to 4 hours each section, and we have to rush. And in that case, we cannot exercise a lot of interaction between the parties. You cannot spend too much time asking about one issue, and the possibility for integrated bargaining, integrated negotiation, like try to find the real interest behind negotiation is a little bit limited. However, I also see a lot of benefits of virtual negotiation, such as more participation from not only the country, but also the number of the person. For example, I have a new colleague who is trying to be negotiator, and when she negotiates, I can still assist her without actually being a official negotiator in the room, and I can still follow because everything was recorded and and I can hear the negotiation without actually participate in the room. I think that's all for my side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Queen, for this really interesting insight. And I think it resonates for most of us in the webinar right now. And I would like now to turn to Aminata also to ask her the same question. And I will do so in French because she will respond in French. Aminata, vous avez écouté aussi les présentations de Taylor qui soulèvent à la fois les défis.
Aminata, you've listened to the presentation from Taylor and the other contributions. With your experience as a negotiator and from your perspective, which of these challenges have you experienced in particular? And can you give us a concrete example of what you have experienced at this level? Aminata, thank you very much indeed, Susie, and thank you, IISD, for having invited us to participate in this discussion. We're very pleased to be able to share our experience with you about everything that's been said. I've heard that the challenges which have been shared here were challenges that were encountered for organizing cooperation. If we stick to that challenge, I think the most important one, apart from human contact, is cooperating in order to be able to reach a consensus. Because it has been said, and I agree with this, that what is written, what is in writing, can commit a state or the person who wrote it. But when you have exchanges in physical, in-person meetings, you don't necessarily have to have to write something. And you can say that this is without what is said is without prejudice to the position of the negotiator in future or to the position of the state that he or she represents. That's in-person meetings. But there are some other challenges which have nothing to do with cooperation, which are rather general in nature. There is one challenge which is valid, be it in online meetings or in-person meetings. There is the language problem, of course, and interpretation problems, be it in rooms. Sometimes there are quite often there are interpreters if we need them, and also online. But if a negotiator has not given his presentation to the interpreters in advance, there will always be something that's lost in translation. The translation is never exactly the same as the original. We suffer a lot from this fact. This applies not just to virtual meetings, but also to in-person meetings at the United Nations. We suffer from what is lost in translation, and translation does not always correspond to what has been said in original. Now, in Africa, in West Africa in particular, there is the challenge of equipment and connections, but there's also the electricity supply problem. Your internet may work very well, but in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, you may have a room, you may have a good computer, you may have an internet connection, but there's no electricity. So how do you connect up to the internet then? Well, there are generators, of course, they can be provided, but one has to come up with remedial solutions to solve these problems. So these are all challenges that might arise, and you don't know how to solve them ahead of time. Then there are also reflection and concentration problems, because when you're on the spot in your own country, as I am today, one is confronted with a number of challenges. You have to provide a public service, so the users who come to see you will never understand that you are engaged in negotiations. If you tell them, oh, no, don't come today, please come back another day, such and such a time. So neither your boss will understand this, nor the users of the public service will understand this. So these then are some of the challenges that we have encountered in relation to this subject. Thank you very much, Aminata.
Thinking about that, but it's a real issue. And in terms of translation, also, this is something important to keep in mind. And I'm wondering, maybe in the chat later on, as we are discussing, we heard just while we are preparing this session with Geoff, the issue of automatic interpretation. And maybe this is something also, it seems we are using more in terms of virtual event, and how this can have an impact and a difference regarding to traditional interpretation with people. So I would like to thank you both for sharing your insight in terms of challenges. And I think we already also started to share some opportunities regarding moving online, but I wish to ask you also if you have some opportunities very quickly in terms of moving online, because we know there are a lot of challenges, but we saw also that there is some opportunities. And I would like maybe to ask to Queen and Aminata very briefly, if you can take one example of opportunities of advantage of moving online you have experimented before we move to the next part of the discussion and provide opportunity for participants to ask questions and make some comment or intervention. Queen, is there at least one positive side of moving online you have experimented? Just maybe one example, very briefly.
I have mentioned previously that the online negotiation enabled better participation from the developing country. We don't have to spend much money on and time travel abroad. And another part is another opportunity is that if the negotiation can be in our normal daytime, so we don't have to suffer time difference. We can contact and consult with other colleagues very easily during the negotiation, and that can accelerate the speed of negotiation. If we have to, for example, go to the US, which is 12-hour different from Vietnam, and we negotiate for 1 week, we cannot get immediate feedback consultation with colleagues from the capital. But now we are in the capital, and the outcome of the consultation can be almost immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Aminata, est-ce que vous avez un point très rapidement sur un avantage quand même, s'il y en a, des négociations virtuelles.
Aminata, would you like to add something about the advantages of virtual negotiation? Reply from Aminata. There are many advantages. I agree with everything that's been said as being advantages. And one advantage is that I can connect and disconnect very easily. The interpreter has lost the sound here. Interpreter has lost the sound. We are having difficulty in hearing you. I don't know whether it's just me. No, it's also the interpreter. Unfortunately, the sound is... So,
Oui, ça va mieux? Oui, on vous entend maintenant.
Now we can hear you better. So, sorry, there was a moment for 30 seconds we could not hear you. So here's another example of a disadvantage of online meetings, says Susie. You were saying that it's possible to follow a lot more meetings and even to follow more than one meeting at a time. I believe that's what you were saying, to follow 2 or 3 meetings at a time with one ear. Aminata, some people are very shy about speaking at an inline meeting. We have a particular meeting and some people are more experienced than others. And when you hear the experts speaking, you think that what you are going to say is not very important. This is in an in-person meeting. But when you are behind your computer screen, you feel more that you are on even footing, equal footing with the experts.
We, just to remind you that we would like also to have a time to present the possible solution and recommendation that Taylor have found, and also discuss that, and more importantly, get insight and ideas from your experience on while we are moving forward. So I will suggest now that we open the discussion with the participant in terms of their comment, reflection, sharing experience regarding these findings. If what we have shared is also something you are experimenting in your day-to-day work and negotiations. And before I ask, Lucas, maybe to provide us a kind of summary of a question and comment we have received on the chat too far, I can see that we have a delegate, Tilani Silva from Sri Lanka, that has raised the hand. Given the time, what I will suggest, what we do now is that we have collect the question on the chat and hopefully have a time to give you the floor to share your experience, and then give a chance also to the speakers to react to what participants have shared on the chat. So I suggest that we start with maybe sharing what was said on the chat, and then hopefully I will give you a chance to say something. Tilani Silva, thank you for your patience. Lucas, is there something you can highlight in terms of what happened on the chat as we are presenting very briefly?
Yes, thank you very much, Susie, and welcome to everyone on this session. We have already received 2 questions and 1 comment. Maybe let me start with the comment by Muatas Hussein, who would like to add to the survey findings the problem of holding more than 1 relevant meeting by at the same time by multiple organizations in an overlapping manner, if that has not been concluded by the findings or if that has not been included. And a second point, that he expects the rapid technology advance in the virtual meetings applications is likely to solve certain issues, especially concerning the lack of personal contacts and opportunities for bargaining. And then let me continue with the first question by Mona Pinchis-Paulsen. It's addressed to Taylor and Zoe. Mona Pinchis-Paulsen is asking whether participants believed the virtual environment was necessary to meet pressing, albeit temporary challenges, or whether there was an understanding that this was the new reality. And there has also been a second question, maybe that I can already add, by Professor Lucas Mistelis, who is wondering whether the surveys reflect on the differences between bilateral and multilateral negotiations. He would assume that in multilateral negotiations, such as in UNCITRAL Working Group 3, it would be natural to have some more frequent incidents of passive or tacit involvement and creation of groups or tribes or herds with respective leaders. Is there any data on that emerging from the studies?
Thank you very much for that. And in terms of comment from Muatas, I can't agree more with that. I mean, we have to, the Zoom fatigue element is there. And I think we all experiment that. Sometimes I'm even dreaming to have at least one day or 1 week in the year with zero meeting, Zoom meeting, if we can have something like that. But I would like to give the opportunity to Taylor or Zoe. Thank you, Zoe, for joining us. And I know it's very early where you are based, to respond to the question that was asked to you specifically. And I encourage our speakers and discussant to also make some comment or respond to the question directly on the chat if you wish to react to some of the question and comments. So we save time also for the second part of the discussion. But at least I would like you, Zoe and Taylor, to respond to the two questions.
Sure, I can give a first response and then Taylor obviously jump in. So thanks to everyone for the comments and questions so far. Mona, I think that's a great question. Something that maybe anticipates a little bit what I'll say in the second part of the presentation, which I'm going to give. But I think, you know, we were framing the study as very much COVID specific, like it's coming out of the current circumstances. But I think the sort of takeaway, one of the takeaways from the survey is that hybrid negotiations going forward are something that are possible, sort of expected, and maybe not entirely a bad thing. So I'll just say that now, and to not give away too much of the game that's coming up. But I think that to some extent, this is a new normal that we'll see more of going forward. I think that was the expectation that I at least got from the survey results. And then the question from Professor Mistelis, I think that's such a fascinating question. Again, we were looking at two specific multilateral processes. I would love to talk more or think more about how this works in a bilateral negotiation. That might be something Taylor is also more well suited to address. But I think that my gut feeling or yeah, is similar to yours, that the dynamics might be different.
I think in the interest of time, I'll be very, very brief. I just want to echo in response to Professor Mistelis's question, something that Quinn said, that I think where we see coalitions that are well established, they have an easier time continuing to collaborate and continuing to text message each other and then cooperate. I think where the difference is very stark in the online environment is getting to know the new negotiators. And so I think that maybe it's easier in a bilateral than in a multilateral setting, kind of identifying and getting to know people. But I think here I'd say we don't have a full answer to your question yet, and that there's a lot of exciting research still to be done, given how the virtual setting kind of scrambles what we thought we knew about negotiations. But I'll leave it there. Thanks for all the questions and comments so far. And a special thank you to Quinn and Aminata and Jeff also for responding to the survey.
Thank you very much, Taylor and Zoe, for your response. I encourage everyone to continue to post some question and comment on the first part of the discussion, including our delegate from Sri Lanka. Sorry, I really apologize for that, but maybe if you can post your comment on your question on the chat, that will be allow us to react to respond, maybe during the second part of the discussion, because we will have again a Q&A session. But I would like to make sure that we have time at least to present the finding, the recommendation and solutions, and to discuss this also before we end the call. So now I would like to invite Zoe to present briefly what the study came up as a kind of recommendation and suggestion, both from what the survey takers have proposed, but also what you have seen as possible option from your own perspective and understanding of the challenges. Zoe, you have the floor.
So thanks everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Taylor, for giving the first part of the presentation. So I'm Zoe Williams, I'm the other author of this paper. So we're going to be talking about two things in the second part of the presentation. Mostly we'll be focusing on our recommendations for governments and for secretariats, and we'll also be sort of looking at some broader final thoughts, areas for further reflection or study. But first, I want to talk about just one final general question that we posed to our survey respondents, which was which phases of negotiation, if any, work well online and which do not. And as I'd already sort of alluded to, many respondents saw a potential for hybrid negotiations. And by that, we're meaning there's sort of two possibilities of what could be a hybrid negotiation. But what we have in mind there is that some phases take place fully online, and then perhaps other phases take place in person. And what our respondents, a lot of our respondents were indicating was that there was a possibility that earlier, more technical phases of negotiations are actually not too poorly suited to be carried out online. And that is something that could happen, whereas other later phases of negotiation that are more crucial for reaching an agreement would be better carried out in person. So as one of our respondents said, they were looking forward to hybrid negotiations as it enables reduction of costs and time for less significant meetings. The in-person negotiations are irreplaceable in critical and substantive phases. So I think that's, again, maybe an answer to Mona's question, that's something that respondents are anticipating going forward. Okay, so now we'll move on to our concrete recommendations. And the first set of recommendations we have are for governments. So the first of these is to minimize distractions or competing priorities for officials, and specifically treat officials that are attending virtual negotiations as if they are attending an in-person meeting, as if they've traveled for this event. And for example, this would entail an expectation that if you email one of these delegates who's participating in an online negotiation, you'll receive an out-of-office reply, right? So just really setting aside that time, even in the office, to truly dedicate to these meetings. The second is to use virtual negotiations as an opportunity for officials from capital to participate formally, even if they've not attended in-person negotiations in the past. And key, of course, is to the extent possible, ensure negotiators have the IT equipment, the broadband connections, everything needed to meaningfully contribute and to participate in these meetings. Our second set of recommendations is for secretariats. So the first of these is to enable informal contact in a virtual environment, first by sharing the contact information of all the participating delegates, making sure that's central, easy to find, accessible for everyone, so that the very first step of those sort of connections can be made online. Second, and to the same end, enable informal contact by making the breaks in a virtual negotiation more like the breaks to the extent possible in an in-person negotiation. So that is an informal, an opportunity to meet informally, to try and have those coffee breaks, to recreate them online. And I think that's something we'd be really interested in hearing from you all, what ways to make that possible if you have suggestions or ideas. Enable more informal contact and also lessen the negative impact of time differences by condensing meetings through having shorter breaks. Certainly the time challenge, the time zone issue is something as someone who's living in California, I'm quite sensitive to. So I think that's really important. There's only so much we can do to change those kinds of facts about the world. But Another recommendation for secretariats is facilitating training sessions to familiarize delegates with the software ahead of time, so that people aren't worried about participating, don't have not just Zoom fatigue, but maybe Zoom nervousness. Ensure an early communication of meetings and schedules and documentation that people need to participate meaningfully. That was also something that came out from the survey, that sometimes those key details weren't being communicated with enough time to actually prepare. And then finally, I think maybe most importantly, facilitate debate and conversation during the meeting by making the comments and questions from all of the delegates visible. So all of the delegates, all the participants know what's being discussed quite clearly. Okay, and then just some final thoughts or reflections. I'm going to end this part of the presentation by first just driving home some final points that we think are really important, again, from the survey, just to underline some of those key results, and then highlight two issues that sort of Taylor and I came up with in response to the surveys that we think deserve further thought and reflection. So the first sort of, again, three final points that we think are really important are that, and we've heard also from our discussants already, is that delegates are facing competing demands on their time that make participating fully in virtual negotiations really difficult. And this is a significant strain that they're facing. Second, lack of informal communication is perhaps the biggest problem, and efforts should be made to recreate spaces virtually to the extent possible in which informal discussion is possible. And similarly, channels for delegates to meet each other are important. And again, that's especially true when you have delegates who have never met in person before. And then these last 2 points are points, I think, that raise both potential problems and opportunities that should be on the radar of anyone who's interested, either from a professional perspective or from an academic perspective, in the sort of way that negotiations are going to unfold in the future. So we worry about hybrid negotiations in which some participants are in the room and some are attending virtually, which is sort of another form that could take. That this risks creating a two-tier system, potentially further entrenching inequalities. If, for example, some delegations with fewer resources make the choice to participate virtually instead of flying to a meeting, we suspect that those who are in the room are going to have an easier time having their voices heard, forming those alliances, and so on, and that those who are participating virtually might be sidelined and be placed at a disadvantage in terms of negotiations. And I think this is especially of concern if unequal vaccine distribution keeps some countries from participating in person for a longer period of time. So again, that's referring to this other type of hybrid negotiation where we have some people in the room and some people virtually Zooming in. We also want to raise the issue that hybrid negotiations may alter negotiators' relationship with their domestic audiences, either by curtailing the ability to reach compromises if those delegates feel very supervised by their capital, their superiors in the capital, if they feel they have less room to move, less room to negotiate because their boss is watching. But that on the other hand, and perhaps more positively, it could enable buy-in and more involvement from domestic actors, whether that is, again, officials in the capital or civil society or industry interests, what have you. So there is a possibility to sort of bring negotiations home and make them more relevant for a domestic audience, which could be a good thing. I'm going to stop there so we have more time for discussion. We really look forward to, especially your reactions to our recommendations and any ideas you all have to sort of facilitate, especially that kind of informal contact between negotiators during virtual negotiations. So I will turn this back to Susie now and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Zoe. This is really interesting for sharing this recommendation, both for government, for the Secretariat, and also this kind of final remarks to keep in mind while we're looking for possible solutions. Of course, this is really a preliminary work, so we still need to reflect on and to dig on. So, and hopefully we may get some interesting and innovative idea from the audience today on the chat. So please start putting your reflection, your comment, your question regarding what is proposed as solution, if you think this is something that can work or not, is relevant or not, or if there are more impactful or important solution to bring on the table. I'm recognizing that the time is flying, but I still have some questions for our discussion on the second part. And here I would like to start very briefly with Queen and Aminata, maybe to share from their own perspective how this kind of recommendation resonate to you in terms of if there is you have also from your perspective solution or recommendation that you think can really make your participation more efficient. And after that, I will go back to Geoff to share some of the findings from his comparative study. And I think you have some interesting information to share with us, particularly regarding the informal discussion and negotiation. So Queen, I would like to start with you again for this round of questions. If you have some additional recommendation from your perspective to share for government and or for secretariat facilitating this kind of negotiation. Do you have some ideas or some suggestions to share here?
Thank you, Susie. With regard to recommendation, I tend to agree with Zoe that the organizer or secretariat should create some additional room for informal exchange during or after the negotiation. And I think, to be more specific, if the secretariat can develop or ask the developer to create some app that allow the participants to create their own breakout room for small talks, that would be great. For example, if we use Zoom now, we can only participate in the breakout room prepared by the secretariat. We cannot, let's say me and Susie, we want to talk outside a little bit. I can text Susie. For example, in ASEAN, we also have a group chat, but it is a little bit distracting operating the Zoom at the same time, or other app like Blue Jeans or Microsoft Teams. At the same time, you have to check your WhatsApp on the phone. So sometimes the new message arrive and you cannot know because you are too much focused on the official negotiation. So if everything is consolidated in the same app, and which have the possibility to allow the party to protect their privacy, that would be great. For example, last year we also participate in some virtual arbitration in the arbitration place, which is a company provide virtual arbitration service for both arbitrator and the parties, and they also create they also have the breakout room for the party, which is quite safe, and the party can say everything, and we know that all the information is protected and it would not be shared to other parties. However, there's still limitation that the breakout room is only created by the organizer. So maybe like we can send a request to the secretariat, me and Susie and the secretariat can provide the breakout room on demand, something like that. That also would be a good choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting and fascinating, and I really do like this idea, and I hope this is something we can bring to the Secretariat, and hopefully the technology allow to have control of this kind of tailored breakout sessions. Now, Aminata, j'aimerais vous poser la même question. Est-ce que de votre côté, vous avez une recommandation particulière qui pourrait faciliter mieux les négociations en ligne, soit à
Aminata, do you have the possibility of making recommendations which or suggestions which might improve things. Maybe you could just propose one or two ideas. Aminata, thank you very much. Susie says Aminata, thank you everybody. I would like to propose some accompanying measures which would be useful for us. Maybe you could continue to make available to us the best practice, the current trends, and also to alert us to the risks that should not be committed in these negotiations, be they online or in presence. And if possible, to always send us the presentations before the meeting in the language of the meeting, and to ask speakers who can speak both languages to sometimes speak French. That would enable us not to have to listen to the interpretation, to use our headsets to listen to the English-French interpretation all day long. Thank you, Aminata. I understand particularly your concern as a French speaker, and this of course also applies to speakers of other languages, be it Spanish or Arabic, to speakers of other languages which are not often used as the main negotiating language in negotiations.
You this question because we know you also have come up with some recommendation in your study, and we will like to hear maybe if you have one or two key recommendations that are quite different from what Taylor and Zoe have presented, or maybe additional one to that. And since we don't have so much time left, I would like you also at the same time, if you can, to share your insight in terms of how we can recreate this kind of informal place for interaction to allow participants to build coalitions. I mean, technically, is there a way to do that? We heard from Queen in terms of be able to have a breakout session, then the question of privacy and confidentiality. I don't know. What are the options actually on the table that we can use for that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susie. Right, well, let me just, I'll try to be as brief as I can here. We have 4 main recommendations that we make, and I'll wrap the question about how to recreate sidebars online into these. And these recommendations largely track the recommendations in the IISD study. Our first main one is to optimize this balance in virtual and in-person negotiating, after the pandemic is over. Our view is that the early phases of negotiations can be conducted online, largely, even asynchronously, which solves some of the time zone problem. Preparatory work on texts, for example, can be done. The middle section of negotiations can be high in the sense that some people can be in the room and others can be coming in online. I'll come back to the technology on that in a moment. Whereas we think the final stage of most negotiations will absolutely require in-person negotiating when sensitive and difficult trade-offs have to be made, and the in-person sidebars are absolutely key to making that work. Our second recommendation is to improve the logistics of virtual and hybrid meetings. We recommend the Commonwealth create a template benchmarking best practices for virtual and hybrid meetings. And this would include such things as governments appointing a lead negotiator to coordinate policies with officials from other ministries in capital, so that capital-based officials in other ministries can participate and feel that they are engaged, but not be singing from a different, if you will, so that each government is presenting one coordinated policy approach. In this, we also include better breakout rooms, virtual breakout rooms, such as using the new Zoom technology in line with the IISD approach, and possibly revisiting rules for accreditation and participation in online as well as in-person negotiations. Increasing funding for connectivity and infrastructure, important here as well. Our third recommendation is that everyone, governments and secretariats, need to prepare to adopt new technologies as they come online as rapidly as possible that make this hybrid and virtual negotiating better. And this can range from things as simple and basic as a new type of face mask that's now being manufactured by Ford Motor Company as a clear plastic sheet over the mouth so that people can read people's lips if they have to speak through a mask in situations where it's not safe to speak uncovered in in-person sessions. So that's things like that. Measures to reduce Zoom fatigue, simple practical steps that can be taken to do that. Companies like Cisco are developing artificial intelligence to decode body language. Coming available. Telepresence technology that will make what we call hybrid, where some people are in the room and some people are out of the room or online. One of the participants asked in the chat about the two-tier system that creates, the disadvantage of people not physically in the room, but new technologies that can be installed in meeting rooms will make it much more possible for those who are online to feel like they are sitting at the table with the people who are physically at the table. That's coming. And our last recommendation is that we need to improve training and capacity building. Everything from training, the mechanics of using the technology, psychological adaptation to virtual communication. And this can be as simple as in developing countries pairing older delegates with younger delegates who are much more tech savvy to help their older colleagues become comfortable with the ins and outs, even the etiquette of when to speak and when to be silent, steps like that. Training workshops. The WTO is already running online training workshops. They're doing this online, so they have experience as well. Last but not least, I'll just mention that we need to encourage capital-based officials to rethink how they do business in a very basic way, to change their mindset. So such as to establish a norm that when someone is in a virtual negotiation, that they don't get disturbed by colleagues with other issues. So a whole way of evolving the mindset of government officials in doing business in a virtual world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean, for this sharing this the recommendation of this study. Unfortunately, we have only less than 5 minutes left normally. Maybe we can kindly ask if the translator are fine with that, maybe take just 1 or 2 more minutes to be able to make sure we finish the discussion properly. But what I would like to do now is maybe to give a chance very quickly to Lucas to let us know what happened in the chat. I think we received some very interesting and sometimes funny recommendation, but I really like it. So if you can very quickly share what are the kind of recommendation and tips exchanging on the chat, and please, we are taking note on every suggestion and solution you are proposing, and we will continue to brainstorm and work on that after the webinar. Lucas, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Susie. So there have been quite a few additional comments and questions on the chat. In the interest of time, let me maybe start with the recommendations and comments. One recommendation by Ariful Hok regarding informal communication in virtual meetings. Secured virtual breakout rooms could be created for 2 or any other limited number of officials to be used in online investment negotiations or seminars. Another recommendation by Brida Okpo from Nigeria. In addition to breakout rooms, it might be a good idea to set out time in the agenda for informal exchange and casual conversations. This way, during these specific breaks, people would be obliged to interact instead of just logging off and going back to real life. There has been another interesting comment by Patrick Okilangole from Uganda. The Secretariat may initiate informal consultations for interaction by including fun topics such as music, food, cultural issues, country-specific events, etc. And now regarding the questions, we have one question by Tilani Silva, representative from Sri Lanka. Given the setbacks highlighted by the presenters and explored in the surveys, it would be very difficult for developing countries to participate constructively at multilateral discussions, especially when they are conducted in hybrid form. So where the in-person participants will be at an advantage. How can this be reconciled in practice? Et nous avons également reçu une question en français de la part d'Aminata Sek. Quels sont les risques?
Question in French: what are the risks of corruption in the context of online discussions or negotiations, if that could exist?
Question sent by our delegate from Sri Lanka, because I promised to give the floor. Maybe Taylor or Zoe, you want to respond to this question, at least very briefly?
I think Taylor actually already responded to it in the chat.
Excellent.
Yeah, but again, just to say we absolutely agree. And it's not easy to come up with a solution, but you've really nailed what one of, I think, the key issues are.
Thank you very much. I mean, okay, so at least maybe for the sake of the translation, we can take also this discussion off. Maybe about the corruption issue. I don't know if this is related to multilateral negotiation or more bilateral negotiation, but I don't think this is something we have touched in the survey or discussed it. Yes, I think it's really an important question also to keep in mind, and maybe we can have opportunity to come back on that. So now we are, I'm sorry, time is flying because the discussion are so interesting and a lot of questions, a lot of comments on the chat. I would like really to thank everyone for attending this webinar. But before we briefly close the session, we would like two things. First is maybe if you can fill in a very brief evaluation form of this webinar. It will take really few seconds, and I will ask Sophia to post the link on the chat. You just have to click on it, it open and take a few minutes to respond to the question. It can be in French or in English, so please take time to do it for us to help improve our event. And while we are doing that, we would like to take a group photo. So I would like to encourage everyone, if possible, to switch on your camera so we can, Sophia can guide us on taking this group photo. It will take only a few seconds. Sophia?
Great, thanks so much, Susie. The survey is in the chat. It is bilingual in English and French, so you can choose which option is best for you. For those who don't have time to do it now, we will also circulate it via email, so you won't have missed your chance to fill in a survey about a webinar about surveys. So for those who are comfortable with turning their cameras on, please do so. I see people are still turning those on now, and that way we can share it on our social media channels. And thank you all for doing this for us today. I'll just give it another second, and then I'll do a countdown just so people can put their picture faces on. And I will also do the same thing and turn my video. So, all right, ready on 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm just going to check to make sure that turned out okay. And I will take one more just for safety in case we had any, eyes closed. Feels like, being at birthday parties of yore. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for humoring us. We really appreciate it, and great to have you all today.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So very quickly, I would like, on behalf of the International Institute of Sustainable Development, to extend my sincere thanks to Aminata, Queen, Jeff, Taylor, and Zoe for making the valuable time available across a wide range of time zones to join us for this enriching discussion. We greatly appreciate all your sharing all of you sharing your insight and knowledge with us. Thank you also to our interpreters, to Sofia Balino for her technical moderation and communication support, and to the rest of the IISD team behind the organization of this webinar, particularly Lucas Schaug, Cesar Arraiz, Abbas Kinda, and Lisiane Lefebvre. As mentioned in the opening remark, we will share the report and today's presentation in English and French version with you after the event. We would like to highlight again that IISD plans to develop specific advisory services and policy tools to assist developing countries in their participation in online negotiation. So please keep an eye out for upcoming initiatives in that regard. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.